For example, this water is Vermont pure natural spring water, extracted tax-free in Vermont and bottled, trucked out and bottled elsewhere. They don't do the bottling here because, of course, that's a business. You've got to pay taxes on doing something, on being productive. But in resource extraction, we're like Nigeria. The corporations come in and just take it all. So that's 1.2 billion, and then 1.5 billion defense budget. Vermont is actually a rich place, resource rich. We've got ample groundwater, and but it's being hyper exploited at such a fantastic rate that people's wells are currently going dry. In fact, my aunt in Richmond, her well went dry, and she's got to pay out of her own pocket to have a deeper well drilled. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that ain't right. So that's one of the reasons why I'm running for Senate. Another reason is that the major parties are not discussing things that they should be discussing, putting all options on the table, as Gaelan mentioned, including the prospect of Vermont becoming its own independent republic once again, if membership in this collapsing oligarchic empire proves to be unhealthy for Vermont. That has to be on the table.
Closing Vermont Yankee is an important part of my platform. I want to turn to alternative energy and get rid of that nuclear plant. We had a meeting in Winooski, and I asked one of the engineers involved in it that what would happen even after you close it. The nuclear material is going to in these storage containers, and if one of those containers is hit by an airplane or there's an accident, what would happen? And one half of New England would become unlivable for the next 100,000 years. And that's just an unacceptable risk, I think. Mm-hmm. We all agree, I think, that Vermont Yankee should be closed, don't we?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was so obvious, I didn't even think of saying it.
Yes.
But what I was leading up to with that was that they're operating practically tax-free and making the energy look like it's cheap, whereas the energy is very, very expensive. What's the risk premium of having those containers there? Who's paying that? Vermont is paying that. That corporation Entergy is not paying it. That's the only thing that makes that energy even remotely accessible to the marketplace.
Yeah, I think the biggest myth, I mean, other than the safety issues, which are by themselves enough to steer the ship in these questions, I believe, but just purely economically, I'm in the renewable energy sector. I'm very deep into the politics of renewable energy and all energy. And, you know, one of my boss actually had a conversation recently with a guy who owns 3 nuclear power plants and asked him point blank, cordially, not in any kind of combative way, you know, what's the economics of nuclear power, and, you know, are you looking to expand, like, what's that prospect? And the guy said, without even thinking about it, no, there's no money to be made in new nuclear power. That's why there haven't been any put online. They're cost prohibitive in terms of the capital you need up front, the long-term tax subsidies you need to operate them, and then just the cost of the uranium and enriching. All the uranium for all of our reactors comes from Australia. It's shipped to a place, I believe in Alabama, where there are 3,000 megawatts of coal power plants, 2 giant coal power plants on site, running constantly just to enrich the uranium to make it reactor grade. And then it's trucked and railed all over the country in highly dangerous transit centers to each reactor, where it's used for a period of a year usually, and then stored on site. When you add up all those costs that we're not paying for, which are buried in our federal income taxes that are subsidizing all of this, you know, the cost per kilowatt hour of nuclear power can't compete with anything right now. And that's why there hasn't been any new investment in it. So, you know, the biggest myth that Vermont needs to realize is that it's not you know, we can't afford to lose Vermont Yankee. We can't afford to keep subsidizing Vermont Yankee and ignoring domestic generation opportunities from hydropower, which is ironically enough blocked by environmentalists in the state of Vermont. We have huge hydropower resources that could be redeveloped, huge opportunities for wind. It might spoil your view, and that's somehow going to collapse the tourist economy if the ridgelines have turbines on them. All these very weak arguments, which in my view come from people who either own a lot of stock in nuclear sector or in natural gas and fossil fuel economies, and they have an economic benefit to the status quo.
I think those big white wind turbines are pretty. I think putting them up on the ridge lines on top of the mountains here in Vermont, it would add to the aesthetic quality of the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
Just like a tree is pretty, so would
Sure.
we would get used to a windmill.
Well, where you and I would agree with that, I think that would be just nifty. There are a lot of people in Vermont have a significant, have their hopes buried in the constantly rising price of their real estate. There's a lot of big landowners in Vermont.
Right.
And as long as the perception persists that this is a bad, not a good, windmills on the ridgeline, people are going to fight it. And there's a tremendous amount of lobbying going on against wind energy because of that. It's going to make our property values go down. For example, in Ripton, there's a lady who sits on hundreds of acres, and she just clear-cut another 50 acres to give a clear path to the ridgeline, and now she's discovered that she can see one guy's windmill halfway up the ridge, and that windmill is a problem.
But they're mistaken. It's a psychological problem, I think. People will become used to the windmills, but Gaelan, you work for an alternative energy company. Would you like to tell us about that? What's the name of the company?
It's Grow Solar. It's headquartered in White River Junction, and it's
Grow
actually,
Solar.
Yeah, it's actually, I believe, fourth largest residential installation company for solar power nationally. We operate coast to coast. It's a pretty complicated operation to try to do renewable energy installation in lots of different states.
So you put solar panels on people's roofs?
Yep. And we do large scale and residential. And we also supply, as a distributor, hundreds of other installers nationwide who don't carry inventory and have on-site engineers. So we provide that. It's a really interesting category. It's got a lot of potential. It's also got a lot of obstacles because there's no continuity in solar or wind in terms of policy. So for a company that would be considering, I'm going to think about putting a manufacturing plant online to produce solar panels in Vermont or to produce wind turbines. They don't know what the next year will look like because every state has a program that's got about a 1-year window on it. And then it might come back, there might be another support program in place, or it might go away. So there's no long-term commitment. And the truth is that there is still a government subsidy required to move this market, just like fossil fuels had to have. I mean, every coal plant ever built got lots of government subsidy. All the power lines everywhere got lots of taxpayer money to put them in place. Subsidizing our energy systems makes sense. It's one of the things that government should do. But for some reason, people complain that we can't afford to subsidize solar power. The truth is right now, the cost to a homeowner of solar energy in Vermont, counting the current subsidies, is 10 cents per kilowatt hour. So if you take your net price that you would invest to put a system on your roof, and then over the 25-year warranted life of those panels, how many kilowatt hours they would produce divided by that cost, it's 10 cents per kilowatt hour. I'm paying 13 cents right now from Green Mountain Power. So solar energy is already cheaper than what we're paying now. And people have this idea that not only is solar power too expensive, but doesn't work in Vermont, and all these myths that are based on numbers that were done 8-10 years ago when the prices were so much higher. So I think that's one of the main close-in energy opportunities that Vermont and every state should be looking at in a much more aggressive way because it creates local jobs. The energy is endless. The systems last basically forever, and everybody has a roof.